Hey, what's going on? Jake here with Uncommon EDC, and today we're going to be talking about an open tag from Boston Blade Reviews. And the topic of conversation is traditional knives versus modern knives. And so, for me, the obvious answer is both, but for the sake of an interesting conversation, we're going to make it a little bit more binary and say if I had to get rid of one in my collection and only buy and keep one, modern or traditional, which would I buy and keep? And so that's obviously a much more binary decision, and a lot of factors go into that. But if you had asked me that question 6 months ago, the answer would have been a pretty snap decision, and it 100% would have been modern knives. And that's because I wasn't even that into traditional knives 6 months ago. I had some modern traditionals, but really very few in my collection. It's been a more recent development that I'm into traditional knives. And so that's definitely interesting, shows how quickly our tastes can change, what we value when we're purchasing knives. And if you look at maybe recent purchase history, not including stuff that came in a subscription because you don't choose that, 8 out of my last 10, I think, were traditional knives that I purchased. And so pretty strongly favoring traditionals, but I was still surprised how difficult a conversation it was to come to a decision, although not necessarily that surprised with what my final verdict was. So with that said, a couple different factors we're going to talk about. I'm going to give points to each one, although I'm not actually keeping track of them. I know what my answer is. And so starting with function. And so one of the main things you think about with traditionals versus moderns is slip joint versus locking. And that's not 100% true. There are traditional knives that have locks, but for the most part, that's a big difference between traditionals and moderns. And so for me, 95% of the stuff I do isn't any less safe or less able without having a lock. And so in theory, it should be pretty equal. But with that said, there are certain tasks, if you're puncturing or stabbing, poking, it's a little bit less safe having a non-locking knife than a locking knife. And there's not really any scenarios where I feel less safe because I have a lock on my knife. So for me, that point has to go to modern knives. Now, jumping to the other side of the fence is just the overall look of the knives, the aesthetics of it. And this one's a tough one because it's, again, what you value. Some people like the look of raw titanium. Some people want something that looks cool or tactical, not something that looks classy or beautiful. And so for me, I do like really classy looking, beautiful knives. And so that's 100% a point in the favor of the traditional knives. You can get beautiful knives on both sides, but it's easier to find, I think, a beautiful traditional knife. And so an example of one, and I just have some random samples, not exactly random, samples from traditional knives on the left, modern knives on the right. These are kind of representative of my collection and what I like in each side of a knife. And so an example of a beautiful knife on the modern side is this QSP Penguin with the Mokutai scales, which is basically a titanium Damascus on the front, and on the back we have this purple anodized scales. As you can see, the hardware is also purple anodized titanium. You have a Mokutai clip. Really, really beautiful knife. But if we go to the other side, something like this Rosecraft Blades Beaver Creek Barlow, I think is equally beautiful and 20% of the cost of the other knife. And so this is a beautiful knife that you can find for $55. Their bone covers that they dye, I think, always look excellent. All the ones I've seen are really excellent. Just the blend of that dye and how vibrant it comes out looks really, really good. And I think it's on the same level as that much more expensive QSP Penguin. Even something, if you're looking at like classy gentleman's knife, I don't have a ton that I would consider. I guess I would consider something like the Chris Reeve Sabenza a gentleman's knife, but a non-knife person wouldn't necessarily. This just looks like a knife. Maybe something like this, probably still not, just because of how big it is and tactical looking, but that abalone inlay is very subtle and classy looking. I think this is a good looking knife, really nice looking overall, but it's also a little bit more aggressive looking, and so not necessarily something I'd consider gentlemanly. A lot of people consider carbon fiber to be a pretty gentlemanly looking, classy looking material. And so maybe this Booz Blades, this one has the green anodized titanium, really nice looking, but it would be for a knife person that's seeing that, maybe they would consider one of those a gentleman's carry. But for a non-knife person, none of those I think would be something that someone would say is like that classy look. But you could easily pick up this Boker club knife and almost anyone, knife or non-knife person, is going to think this is a classic look to it and really just overall more something that would resonate with non-knife people. Same thing with this GEC. This is a 56 pattern. It's got that avocado jigged bone. It's just a classic look to it that more people are not only going to find looking better, but less intimidating. And so that's another point in the traditional camp. They overall, I think, look a little bit better and overall are going to be less intimidating than modern knives. Now, that's again 100% up to your preference, because maybe you're not looking for something that looks classy. You want something that just looks insane. And so like this Arcane Design crawler is going to fit into that category. Just an insane looking knife that's really cool, sci-fi vibe to it. And so it's really going to depend on preference. But for me, I do think that traditionals win that category. Now, next up is Craftsmanship. And so this is another one that's probably pretty obviously leaning into traditional, although not as far as you might think. And so with traditionals, there's general expectations of exactly what to expect in terms of craftsmanship, in terms of the walk and talk and the gapping and how flush the pins are or the shield is. And so you have exact expectations of what you would be considered good fit and finish. With modern, it's really up to interpretation, because all knives are so different. Do you judge what the back looks like of a knife? Some have back spacers, some don't, some are integral, and so it's a little bit harder to judge. You can get fit and finish, but it again might be up to preference what the detent's like, and if there is even a detent, depending on the locking mechanism and how the flipper tab functions and how it's laid out, it's going to be different from every knife. And so it's not as cut and dry on the modern side. And so you're also mostly machined on the modern side, where you do get hand finished knives on the traditional side. Not always, but more often than you would on the modern side, unless you're talking customs. And so that should be an obvious point in the traditional favor. But I mentioned already, it's a little bit closer than you might think, because I also take into account that each of the designs on a modern knife is different. So there is a level that goes in with the designer, at least. Whether it's machined in the end, the designer is still coming up with new innovative things and exact specifications for their designs. And you do get craftsmanship on something like the Sebenza, with the overall tolerances being much smaller or lower than you would expect on other knives, and that hydraulic feel. It's not like a fidgety knife, but that hydraulic feel that you get with every Chris Reeves knife. And so there are things that go into it that I do think show a level of craftsmanship, but it's still a lot easier to see on the traditional side. So another point there in their favor. Now from there we go to build quality. And so these traditional knives, we have examples that have lasted 100 years. And so we know that the build quality is there, but at the same time, there's other things that go into that. And part of that is, for me, build materials. And so we get things like titanium or better steels that get introduced every few years and things like that. And so for me, I think I'm favor that a little bit on the modern side, and more because there's what might come out in the future. The steels keep getting better and better. We're not really seeing the steels change that much on the traditional side of the house, but on the modern side, we get better and better steels every year. So if in a year that an asteroid crashes into Earth and it has this rare metal from space that once they sharpen it, it never loses its edge, I want to try that on a knife, but you're not really going to see that on traditional knives. So the ability to see upgraded and better materials and different materials that you wouldn't necessarily see on a traditional knife, I think gives a point to the modern. And that kind of leads into the next point too, which is innovation. Traditional knives by their very nature are really staying the same. You have this history behind these patterns, and there's rules to those patterns, and so you don't see a lot of changes. And when you do, it moves into that kind of modern traditional category that people really are looking at differently than normal traditional. But on the modern side, we have a lot of new innovations, and so we see different lock types. We have frame lock, compression lock, button lock, maybe liner lock, no liner lock on the table, but you see a bunch of different locking mechanisms. We have thumb holes, front flippers, regular flippers, thumb studs, and button lock deployment. And so a lot of different deployment methods as well. And you continue to see more. So you get things like this every couple years, like from Andrew Demko, this shark lock, which is a new innovative lock. Functions not that differently than some other locks, but it is a new lock, and it was something that was really exciting. This is a cool one because it's a budget version of it, but there was a nice custom version of these as well. Not the best looking knife on this 80 20.5 version, but still really cool, that innovation. You got that shark lock, super fun and fidgety. Same thing with this Fox radius, not really something you would see ever on a traditional knife because there's these rules that they're sticking to, but on there they can try out these new weird things. And so this is sort of a button lock, but the button rotates along this track, and so you have to push the button both to open it. It's locked closed, can't be opened, so push it both to open it and to close it. And so that's a cool thing that you're not going to get with traditional knives, that level of innovation. Things like what Winter Blade Co. is doing with magnets and their electronic out the front that I think he was working on. It's just all really cool stuff that I wouldn't want to miss out if I had to give up one or the other. I'm going, and that's a heavy point for me in the modern side of the house. Now the next thing I'd say is probably fidget factor, which isn't a huge factor in terms of overall use of the knife, but it's one of the things that a lot of us do with our knives more than actually using them. And so this is closer than you'd think too. With traditionals, it's a different type of fidget, but it's still there, that walk and talk, people enjoy and will sit there opening and closing their knives over and over and really just enjoying the feel of that. But it's a two-hand fidget, and it still is a fidget factor for me. So it's closer than you'd think, but with modern knives, one hand openable, one hand closable is a big thing for me. It's not necessarily present in every single modern knife, but you get it a lot more common where you can fidget with these, one hand open, one hand close them. You can do it in meetings while you're driving, and so probably not that safe to do it while you're driving, but I do it all the time. And so the fidget factor is definitely another point in the modern's favor. Now the last thing that I kind of want to point out is the price point. And so this is really going to depend on how you shop. But for me, it's a pretty big factor. When you look at the knives on either side, these are mostly knives that you'd probably consider expensive in each category. So even though the moderns are significantly more expensive than the traditionals that we have on the table, the traditionals, a lot of these are more expensive traditionals. And so price-wise, traditionals are 100% better. And if we were to introduce something like a $75 budget, so from now on I can only ever buy a $75 knife, then 100% it makes an easy decision. I would go with traditionals. And that's because you can get traditionals for a good price that are great looking and really functional. With moderns, you can definitely get really functional knives. There's some excellent knives under $75, but I do feel like you give up that overall aesthetic. You're getting very kind of similar things in most of our under $75 knives. On the modern side, you're going to get G10 or micarta, maybe stainless steel handles, and some more limited blade steels that will be similar to the mix that you see on the traditional side. Obviously not the exact same steels, but a similar number of available steels at that price point. And you get a lot of different designs, but I don't necessarily think I would have a hard time finding knives that are as good looking as the 5 or 6 knives that we have on the table on the modern side under $75. Now, if we did that same exercise with the traditional knives, I don't think it would be that much of a drop off. So something like this Boker Club knife is obviously micarta. This is a more modern material, but still would be considered, I think, a traditional knife. And then you have the brass bolsters and liners. Would maybe replace something with this Rough Rider. Obviously pattern preference is going to come into play here, but look wise of the scale or the covers and those bolsters, I think this is a pretty similar comparison for $20 versus $80. And so not that steep of a drop off. I do think obviously the Boker is a better looking knife, but not that steep of a drop off when we're looking at those side by side. Now, similarly, something like this GEC 56, this one's a little bit harder. I didn't have an exact replacement, and I probably would have replaced it with the Skater Skin. This is around $130-ish, I think, whereas the Gator Skin Baron Sons is around $60. So that would be an easy replacement, but since it's already on the table, I just went with a completely different cover material that I think also looks really nice. And this is a buffalo horn. I think this was called the Devil's Cut. Another Baron Sons knife though. But you can get in there, get a nice looking cover, and it's significantly cheaper without that much of a drop off in terms of the overall looks. We can leave the Baron Sons Gator Skin because that is already under $75. And I did put the Smockadile, this is the Spyderco Smock customized by River's Edge Cutlery, on the modern side. I don't think you're really gonna find anything like this under $75 on the modern side, but its comparable knife here with the Gator Skin, just kind of a fun comparison, is already under that $75 price point. Knocking out another GEC. GECs are the more expensive on the traditional side, so that's why all of these ones are kind of disappearing from this list. But taking this one out, we'll replace it with the Lusahatchee. Oh no, that's not this one actually. This is the French Broadjack from Rosecraft Blades. And so another Rosecraft Blades, you can see same thing on the die job. This one's red instead of orange, but just excellent looking. This is barely a drop off, if any at all, and maybe down to preference on if that's a drop off at all in terms of overall looks compared to the GEC. And so last GEC coming off the board, this is the 49 in blue camel bone. And this one, there's a few that I think look pretty comparable. This one's from Rough Rider, newer knife from them. This one's obviously a lot darker of a dye, but on both of them you're gonna get darker and lighter, and so still a drop off overall on the overall looks of them. Of course I prefer that GEC, but it's not as significant as dropping from something like this down to a G10 or micarta or something like the titanium to a stainless steel. Isn't that big of a drop in look. Obviously it's gonna be a little bit heavier and stuff like that, but you're not gonna get anything close to the level of scales that you see on the modern knives for under $75. The closest you'll get is probably that carbon fiber, especially with the Smockadile, since it's just a carbon fiber laminate over G10. But other than that, it's gonna be really hard to find replaceable knives there. So with that said, my final kind of decision here is still going to be modern knives. I can't give up the just different deployment methods, locking methods, and steels that may come out in the future. And so if I had to choose one, it would be down to that as the deciding factor and why I would go with moderns. Now, if the limit was $75, it would change my decision to traditionals, but that wasn't the topic of today's video, so modern is going to be the one that wins out. Now, one other thing that I do want to mention, and this one's probably a little bit more controversial, is modern traditionals. And so I also really like modern traditionals, and I don't know where that would fall in this decision-making process. Do those count as moderns? Do they count as traditionals? Probably moderns, because they're modern, and so probably moderns, and that would allow me to continue to pick up slip joints. And I really like these, but I think this one's a little bit more decisive. People that are into moderns that maybe want to try out in traditionals, I think, are more into modern slip joints, whereas people who are into traditional knives mainly are a little bit more skeptical, I feel like, of modern traditionals. That's not always the case, but in general, I think modern people are more open to modern traditionals than traditional people are to modern traditionals. And so I have a lot of really cool versions of these. The first one is the Surge Slip 7. Did a video on this one pretty recently, but has a lot of the things that I like about traditionals, but with a lot of modern construction. It has that raw titanium look that you're really not gonna be able to get in a traditional knife, and still has the same similar feel. Really excellent walk and talk on there, and just a cool knife. And same thing with this notorious EDC Kingpin. This one has a titanium bolster, micarta scales, M390 on that blade steel, and I believe the Surge Slip 7 is also M390. But this is really what got me back into traditionals, and so I think this is a really cool thing to have. But I would love to hear what people think about, first, whether they would choose modern or traditional in the comments, but also where modern traditionals land for you. Is this something you're into, or is it something you're completely against? And if you are into it or against it, let me know if you prefer modern or traditionals generally, because I think that's going to make a big impact on the numbers. Here's another from Traditional Pocket Knives. This is the Ohio River Jack. Really, really excellent one. So that one's super cool. Just picked up the Jack Wolf knives. laid back jack and the purple Kieranite, another really beautiful example. This one, I believe, I forget what the blade steel is on this, S90V on this one, titanium bolsters, Kieranite, which you do see on traditionals, but not with the titanium bolsters. Tactile Knife Co. Bear, another really cool slip joint, modern construction with Ultim scales on this one. This one's really cool because you're not going to see anything this thin from a typical traditional, so I think that one's really cool. And then the other kind of similar category is the moderns that are just inspired by traditionals, and so these would definitely fall in the modern category for me, but something like the Gunslinger Jack from Jack Wolf Knives or the Finch Buffalo Tooth, I think this one was called. Yeah, Buffalo Tooth, 154 cm, jig titanium, completely modern. It's a flipper, it's a frame lock, but it's inspired obviously by a traditional pattern. And so a lot of really cool things to look at. Would love to hear your thoughts first and foremost on the modern versus traditional, but then where modern traditionals fall into that category, because I think that's something that's going to be a little bit more decisive. I think most people that are into one or the other, one being modern versus the other being traditional, if you're into one or the other, you still see the merits of the other one, where I think modern traditionals fall a little bit outside of that. But this ended up being a pretty long video. Thank you if you stuck with me, really appreciate it. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification button. If you have a channel, definitely feel free to respond to the open tag Boston Blade Reviews in that. I'm sure he'd appreciate that. And as always, I hope you have a great one. Take care.